Hey, what's up? Have a bunch of props here to answer one of the questions that came through from Instagram. So the question was pretty linear. Can you talk about how professional basketball players tear their Achilles? And as usual, I'm not able to answer such a question because to go by just what that question is asking is a million different reasons and doesn't necessarily help us understand how to help others. Number one, the components to basketball, whether it's at the professional level or not, are very very similar to other components that we are able to talk about. So the fact that it's a professional basketball player versus a football player, of course, there's different specific and special movements that are different in those two sports. But when you look at team handball, it is extremely similar to what we see in basketball. That being said, well, we're talking about until perhaps later at the end, maybe depending how I feel, we can talk about some particular instances that I've dealt with in my career. But that being said, nothing that we're going to talk about is specific to Achilles and professional basketball. Furthermore, I don't know that there's anything genuinely unique on how an Achilles tendon tears at a very global level compared to how any other tendon tears. We'll get into the different forms of tearing of tendons, where we may say something is a tendonitis, which would be the first few days. A tendinosis, really the global component, would be called tendinopathy. But a full thickness tear, which is really where I'm guessing the spirit of that question happens, and we will see these quite commonly in explosive team sports. Any stop and start or agility, even if it's lateral, I think you'll certainly see it in tennis as well. So these are things that will apply to all levels of sport. So I am going to start by using this thing right here to begin our understanding of how anything breaks. Okay, so first of all, we look at the sled, and we're going to suggest that the sled in the system that we're going to create is the most robust component. All right, the sled is made out of metal, it's got wheels on it, it's one big piece. It's going to be very very hard to break. And attached to the sled is our component, the cord, which we know is from a TRX. So you know what that feels like. It's got a lot of fabric, and the fabric is weaved in a particular way. And then it has this little hook where I'm going to put my hand, and now I think we can create this illustration of I am probably, of these three things, if all things were equal, I am the weak link. I am going to break first. The opportunity for me to break or tear somewhere from my head to my toe is going to be higher here than it is through this cloth. This cloth can break just like I can, but it's going to take a much more unique force, a different angle of force, and a degree of force. So I break first. This cord breaks second, and the sled will probably break last. But they all can break, and they all can break under different circumstances because they all have some things that are in common. What do I have in common with this cord, which also has in common with that sled? Well, the answer to that is that we're all governed by similar rules and similar qualities in the laws of physics. So I am going to only use laws of physics if any of the words that I use you are accustomed to a different definition. Well, you're more than welcome to use that. I'm going to use the ones that are governed by the laws of physics on this planet. Many people change different words around. I talk about it very, very often because it creates discord of like, well, so-and-so said this. Well, so-and-so said this. I'm telling you where I'm getting my words, and if I choose to make up a word, you'll know that I made up a word, and I'll be very clear as to why I'm making up said word. Right now, I'm making up nothing. I'm going to break before the cord, before the sled. Now, the relationship continues in terms of an analogy, okay? I am the muscle in most situations, similar to explosive athletes like the basketball player. We know it happens in other sports and it happens in life. but I am the muscle. This is the tendon. So the tendon attaches to the muscle here, but the tendon also attaches to the bone there. And think, a bone would clearly break before a tendon, which would happen before the muscle, because the muscle is the weakest link. That's what I want to start this conversation on, as to how can we impact, or better yet understand, why this thing broke before the muscle. Because when someone has an Achilles tear, it doesn't mean that there weren't micro injuries or tearing to the muscle. It doesn't even mean that the bone wasn't compromised. Maybe the tendon was avulsing a little bit. But ultimately, the degree and combinations available to break a bone is much, much smaller than the degrees and combinations to tear a muscle. They're all made out of relatively the same things, but in different percentages. I'm the muscle, this is the tendon, that's the bone. Now, when we say that they're made out of a lot of the same things, we can talk in a word that is governed in physics, and the first time hearing this word and understanding it this way, you all know the word, but the word is stiffness. And stiffness sounds ugly. Man, I don't want to be stiff. And I remember reading Shirley Sarman's first book, God knows when the hell it was written, and she used stiffness quite a bit, because a lot of people are unaware that Shirley Sarman's, one of her PhDs, if she has more than one, I know at least one, is in molecular biology, and understanding at a molecular level how different biological tissues react and or interact with each other. So what she would always talk about is that the part of the body that is moving the most is usually your target to solve the problem, and in part of that solution, you would create stiffness in other areas. It was really quite a precursor to the joint by joint theory. It's really saying a lot of the same things. Unfortunately, Shirley Sarman, at least to my knowledge, never really carried from tip to tip in terms of how these adjacent joints, in terms of tissue stiffness, would impact. She talked about the lower body affecting the lower body and the upper body affecting the upper body. We couldn't go from shoulder to toe like we can in using other models. That being said, the constituency of the tissues is not the only way in which mobility and stability are governed. But remember, from this point, we're going to try to understand the difference between muscle, tendon, and bone, and we're going to use stiffness to make that decision. So here's the example of stiffness. Two things can have the exact same length, but they require more force to deform. Okay? And the best example is what I have here. We've got two Perform Better minivans. Okay? And when they come out of the factory in Warwick, Rhode Island, they are exactly the same length. But we know that this yellow band is really, really stretchy, and we know the blue band is less stretchy. They're both rubber bands, and I would insist that if we take the same amount of distance between the two, it will obviously take much less force to get this one to go further. But if I put a tractor trailer next to this one and somebody pulling this one, they'll get to the same place, and this one won't break because this one is stiffer. Whatever is part of this rubber band, whatever this is actually made out of, they're made out of more individual little rubber band things than this one, okay? And when we talk about tissues that are stiffer, indeed, the stiffer tissue will break less. And in the case of understanding muscle, tendon, and bone, a stiffer tendon will improve or be able to deliver a higher degree of performance to the system. Meaning you will be able to pull a bigger sled without the muscle or the bone breaking, and you'll be able to pull it faster because this tendon will transmit forces from the muscle, where the forces are primarily generated, through this thing and move the bone. The bone won't move unless the muscle grabs onto the tendon to create this motion. So when we look at forces and we look at understanding why things break, we're going back to the original question, of the Achilles tendon, this is a very good tendon because I can pull really, really hard and use a lot of this muscle and move the bone. That's performance. I can try to move it faster. I can move it slower. I can do a lot of different options which might be valuable to performance. Okay? However, let's go back to who breaks first. When the tendon is stiffer than the muscle, then this would explain why muscles tear. Because if this is super, super stiff and the bone is really, really heavy, and I am contracting the muscle and I am shortening it and shortening it and shortening it, I am much more keen to have failure in this system. But the tendon won't break because the tendon is stiffer than the muscle. If it was the opposite, and if we take this tendon off the bone and we use something that is very, very polar opposite. We use this yellow band, also came from Warwick, Rhode Island, and we attach this yellow band, this tendon, to the bone. And I am the exact same muscle, it goes nowhere. Because now I am stiffer than the tendon, and I cannot transmit as much force to move the bone. So tendons that are not stiff, really not very, very good for performance. Muscles can have incredible amounts of force production and or stiffness, but in this case, this tendon probably won't break unless we have different interface issues between where the muscle grabs the tendon and where the tendon grabs the bone. But that's not how this tendon breaks in half, okay? So next, what happens if we train for stiffness and then we turn this yellow rubber band into a green rubber band? This band, again, is going to attempt to transmit forces from the muscle to the bone. So we put it in here, and of course, this is what happens on live TV. And we latch it in. Now I can put similar amounts of force, but at the end of the day, if I can create less distance, I might be able to move the sled a little bit, but my performance is still very, very poor. So of those three options, you want tendons that are very, very stiff, okay? So now, we're not even at the tendon injuries yet, but now, who hates training? Training, or the guys that hate training in this professional explosive athlete world are the ones that are the most wired. They have the best neural components to create force really, really fast, and they hate training because if they train hard and heavy, they start to feel slow. It dampens the nervous system, so they train really, really fast, whether it's their sport or using submaximal loads at an incredibly high rate of force development. They basically are getting good at what they're good at, and that explains why muscles tear, because they are increasing stiffness into the tendon, they are improving performance, and they are increasing risk for muscle injuries. This is why we should have a great appreciation that muscle injuries are incredibly modifiable. Maybe that's a better word than prevention or even limitation. Get strong. But if you get strong, and that's not part of what we're talking about, different protocols which are out there, and we can talk about them another time. The protocols that make muscles a little bit stiffer protect the tendon, and in theory, they may likely decrease performance, meaning so-and-so will be a little bit slower, but he'll be able to play 17 games instead of 13 or 14 from hamstring pulls, groin pulls, and quad pulls that you see in these explosive sports. Now, what if there was a calf pull, okay? Tendons, even under the highest levels of stiffness, will tear when there's multiple things. Number one, things tear when they get long. You can't, like when a muscle is contracting and it's getting shorter, things are closer together. That's the opposite of tearing. Tearing is when they pull apart. So if we are able to put incredibly high degrees of force, whether you have it from the maximal force production of the muscle or from the neural rate of force development, if you are yanking at the tendon And the joint doesn't want to move because other factors of the joint create stiffness. Not the tendon, but the connective tissue around an ankle that doesn't really want to dorsiflex, but you're going to pull it. Now you have an example of how a stiff tendon is really, really good for performance. Is it really the tendon's fault? Or was it that the joint didn't have the mobility to allow the muscle to pull on the tendon to put the joint in the desired position? So what do we do about that? Basically, we're suggesting that there was not equal co-contraction around that joint. You can't put as much force into a joint that doesn't have mobility. You will likely jeopardize the tendon because it won't be able to continue to transmit that force because the bone refuses to move. Not because the muscle's not strong enough, but because the connective tissue around the joint is too stiff, which is not always related to the tendon. That's one reason. Number two, if you're in some other weird position, meaning you take contact and you're now put into this unfamiliar position, same thing happens. Force is very, very high. The joint is unfamiliar. The motor strategy is unique, and we were not able to maintain the ideal joint position. So again, the tendon tears because it's doing a great job of transmitting force. It's just not getting to the bone. Lastly, which is maybe the least or the most challenging to prove, is the relative work capacity of the entire system. Because if an individual is under recover and different factors of that under recovery is impacting spontaneous electrical activity into the muscle, then indeed a combination of all of the above, unique positions, non-ideal joint motion, but a unique firing pattern that the body or the human system is not accustomed to, you no longer have the same strategies. And when you don't have the same strategies, I'm not suggesting that is an injury predictor. I'm saying that is a level of consistency that is no longer applied from how you practice. AKA, if you practice under good conditions and then you're fatigued in your performance, how do you get injured for basically no apparent reason? You might have good joint mobility. You might have done a step back with your left foot, I don't know, after missing 2 months of playing because you had a calf injury, and all of a sudden your Achilles pops. Well, maybe not playing for 2 months and only getting 2 practices in before you came back in the finals had something to do with how the body recognized what is a very, very normal basketball move, but because there was terrible levels of under recovery, basically if an individual didn't have the same levels of work capacity in which he learned how to perform those incredibly explosive, jerky movements like a step back, and all of a sudden that step back yanks so hard, that jerky movement creates changes in the crosslinks of the tendon, not the muscle. So those are the different reasons, even under a brilliant circumstance, as to why a stiff tendon would tear. Because ultimately you want a stiff tendon. And that's why probably we see way more muscle injuries in these explosive sports in the most explosive guys, because the most explosive guys have the stiffest tendons and they hate training slow. They won't lift. So if you don't lift, you can't mitigate. You can't even try to balance the factors, but you'll still be really, really fast. And there's probably a bigger chance of getting banged up. So this applies in all systems on when do we see a broken bone, when do we see a broken tendon, and when do you see a broken muscle, okay? Most of the time you see the muscles, but the question was, what happens or why does a professional basketball player tear their Achilles? Number one, lack of joint mobility and high levels of force, unique positions where maybe they're being contacted and there's no motor skill in which is familiar, so then the tendon is basically receiving incredible amounts of force in a completely unfamiliar position. That's number two. Number three, probably a little bit more opinion, less to do about mechanics, but the mechanics become affected by the effects of relative increases in acidosis and hypoxia, which in my mind is the governing bodies of consistent performance. So if we're not going to be performing consistency, it's not only about does the ball go in the basket or do you hit the ball on the club as perfectly as you can, but all facets of human performance become inconsistent, including motor strategy. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that answers a little bit of why explosive athletes will tear different tendons or break other parts of the body. And indeed, if you've ever seen a leprechaun, say, yeah,